Good. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. A very warm welcome to all of you, and thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming. We anticipated it to be even fuller, but maybe because of either weather or long weekends, maybe a few people might not have come. Regardless, very much happy and very happy to have you here this afternoon. I will talk very briefly. I'm just the warm-up for our masterclass speaker later on. Basically, War Child a couple of years ago has changed our strategy, a new strategy for the coming 5 to 10 years, and have really said we want to deepen the expertise that we have in addressing well-being of children affected by armed conflict. And as part of that, we said we wanted to organize a series of masterclasses on topics that are relevant to the work that War Child does. So this is the third one in this series. We started off with a masterclass on stigma and stigma reduction, followed by another one on mindfulness and the development of mindfulness as an intervention that is relevant maybe for us. And then today we're looking at child rights, which of course is a topic very close and important to an organization such as ours. Very shortly, my name is Mark Jordans. I am heading the Research and Development Department here. I will just give a very short introduction on how this is relevant to the topic of today is relevant to our work. And we'll then introduce Professor Ton Liefaard, who will give the masterclass, which was then supposed to be followed by a reflection on what that means for us as an organization by the managing director of War Child, Tjibke Bergsma. Unfortunately, he cannot join us today because of personal circumstances. So we will have time afterwards for question and answer and discussion, but we will not have Tjibke's talk today, unfortunately. So without further ado, get started and really see if this works. Not yet. Can you? That works. So why is this relevant? As I said a couple of years ago, with our a new strategy, we have decided to work on a coherent set of interventions within War Child that we want to develop and research, and that collectively contribute to the well-being and resilience of children in armed conflict. Now, of course, this is something that War Child has done for the last 20 years that it's been active. But what is new is that we say, okay, we want to be more specific in what those interventions are and how they contribute to well-being and increased resilience, and prove that works, and actually research that. Now, we call that those collection of interventions. We call that the care system that we're developing, and this care system basically consists of a number of interventions that let's say bring together or combine interventions that focus on psychosocial and psychosocial well-being and mental health of children, that focus on child protection of children, and on the education and the educational platform. So we bring those together in that care system. The care system also reaches out directly to children, but also goes beyond that and addresses the parents of children, and working with parents or peers, working with the school system and teachers, working with the community within which the children grow up. So to really work at all of these levels. Thirdly, we are addressing with that set of interventions, we are addressing all of the children or parents that are in the communities where we work, but also those that have more severe problems. And basically, if you're looking at this as a pyramid, you will see that children higher in the pyramid, or populations higher in the pyramid, reflect children with more severe complaints. So what we are doing is we say we want a set of interventions that address all children, but also specific groups of children that have more severe problems, maybe mental health problems, maybe child protection problems, etc. So that's kind of the characteristics of the care system that we're building. The last defining characteristics is that we are these interventions are implemented by non-professionals. And this is a big shift, as you can imagine. Interventions here are often provided by professionals. Could be mental health professionals, could be social workers, etc. In the settings where we work, and sure, some of your organizations, we do not have professionals to provide that care. So we're shifting those tasks to non-professionals. So that's the last characteristics of this care system. Oh, can I try? Yeah, great. And I'll come back to that, the system of care and what's in it to make a relation to child rights. But first, the second element of what we're doing in our strategy. So one is to develop this system of care with these interventions. The second part of it is to really deepen our expertise in those interventions. And we're doing that through very rigorous steps of development and research. So for each of the interventions, we are quite systematically saying, okay, how do we develop this intervention in the best possible way, to then go on to research it and establish whether this intervention has the expected outcome. So is the intervention effective or not? And you'll see that here in the bottom. And this is quite new in the sector. So what we're saying is, it's not just good enough to provide this care. We want to be able to scientifically demonstrate that this care is actually working. So we want to establish the effectiveness or the efficacy, if you like, of the care that we're providing. So that's a very big part of our goal to become more an expert organization. But there, it doesn't stop there. Even if we've demonstrated that the care that we've developed work, we want to be able to implement it at such a scale that we actually reach as many children as possible. At the moment, there's 450 million children that are directly or indirectly affected by armed conflict. If we want to reach as many as possible of those children, we need to have interventions that are easily scalable. So we are not just going to demonstrate that the interventions that we're developing work, but also that we have a system of implementing them with sufficient quality. Now, that in very short is what we're doing in the research department around that care system. Now, the reason why I introduced these is, oh, sorry, maybe go back one slide. This is Ton's start. So that care system, as I said, consists of 9 interventions. Now, how do those relate to child rights? And this was very much at the heart of today's talk, and inviting Professor Ton Liefaard to come and talk to us today. War Child has from the child been an organization that has centrally adopted child rights, and that is and calls itself a child rights organization. But then if I push myself further and say, well, so if this work that we are doing and the developing of a care system of interventions around child psychosocial well-being, child protection and education, how do they relate to child rights? And I want to give a couple of examples before handing it over. So one of the interventions is, for example, let me start with an intervention that focuses on parents and caregivers. If we want to improve the being of children, one way to do that is actually by supporting the parents that grow up in areas of armed conflict, by reducing the stress of the parents, by increasing their capacity to do good parenting in a situation of high stress. So we are really targeting parents in their role as primary caregivers. And that translates very neatly onto, for example, Article 18 in the Convention for the Rights of the Child, that parties shall render appropriate assistance to parents in their child rearing responsibilities. So it's a perfect match to that. Let me take another intervention, another of those 9 interventions. We are looking at a situation in armed conflict where there's increased child abuse, increased neglect and maltreatment as a result of violence and conflict. We are developing an intervention that really focuses on strengthening the community and community members to develop a system to respond and to prevent child abuse and child neglect and child maltreatment. So rather than an external agency coming in and setting up child protection systems, have the community themselves be responsible for that and have a methodology for that. So that intervention, which we're developing and testing, maps perfectly on Article 19, and I'm sorry I have to read it, but that states that parties shall protect the child from all forms of violence, injury, and abuse, neglect, and maltreatment. So we are contributing to that. Another intervention that we're doing is quite innovative. Is providing education and basic numeracy and basic literacy to children that cannot go to school. So in settings of armed conflicts or refugee children that do not have access to normal schooling, can we still provide them an opportunity to learning? And we developed an innovative digital game-based platform through tablets so that children can still learn basic numeracy, basic literacy through those tablets, even if they don't go to schools. And we are testing whether that works and whether indeed children are learning in that way. And this perfectly, again, maps onto Article 28 that states that children have the right to education, and then goes on to specify issues around the quality of education, etc., etc. We have basically 9 interventions plus what we call a few more enabling components. So a set of 12 interventions that all map onto the Convention for the Rights of the Child, one way or the other, as I've just given 3 examples. Now, if I'm critical, though, and that's really my last remark, is that's pretty easy. It's easy to kind of say, well, this is what we're doing, and then find somewhere in that long text, the text of the Convention of the Right of the Child to say, oh, look here, we match here, kind of highlight it, as I've done for this exercise, and say, look, we map onto the CRC. That's great. Yes, but that's a bit superficial, and it's also a bit simplistic to do that, because that doesn't really mean we are engaging with the Convention of the Child of the CRC. It doesn't mean it's a very unidirectional way of dealing with that. It's basically saying, look, we are developing all of this, and how does that map onto that? Now, I'm being overly critical because, of course, some of the work that we're doing is generated by years of working in the space of being a child rights organization, but I think that is something that we need to deepen if we really want to take this on board. And with that, I really would like to hand it over to Professor Liefaard to say, okay, well, provide that much bigger and much more in-depth view of it. And with that, I would like to introduce Professor Ton Liefaard, and Ton is the Vice Dean of the Leiden Law School, and holds, and that's especially relevant for today's talk, the Unicef Chair in Children's Rights at the Leiden University. He's also the director of the Master's Program Advanced Studies in International Children's Rights, and he coordinates the Leiden Summer School in International Children's Rights. We've met maybe a year ago or a bit longer, and I'm very happy that you're here and share your knowledge. So please welcome Professor Liefaard.
De onderste? Eén onderste, okay. All right, good afternoon. Thank you for having me. Thank you for being here. It's an opportunity, always, to speak about the field I like to work in, to work for. It's a great pleasure to connect the work I do as an academic with the work of War Child. And I'm sure that there is people in the room that are not working for War Child, and I know there is people in the room because I see my own students in the room. But I assume that everyone is in one or the other way related to the work War Child is doing, or to children's rights, or at least have a keen interest in children's rights. So feel free to join me this afternoon in having a conversation about the meaning of international children's rights for children across the globe. I've chosen the title "Children's Rights from Theory to Reality," or to practice, translating policy into practice, and that is something that we are constantly working on, to really understand what the meaning is of international children's rights as laid down in international instruments such as the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And how can we actually translate these norms into actual action around children, and children in the context where they live in? And that is something that confronts us all the time with many questions. And what I would like to do today is to share some observations in that regard, building on 30 years of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, because this is 2019, and 2019 is the year in which, on the 20th of November, we will actually stand still for a while, say, listen, okay, now we have 30 years of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. What does that mean, and where should we go to? What should be our aspiration for the years to come? Feel free to interrupt me if you need to interrupt me, and otherwise there will be enough time for questions afterwards. I would like to go back to 1989, 30 years ago. It is a time frame that is, it was a time frame that is completely different compared to the time frame we are now in. But it is an important point of departure, I think, of my talk this afternoon, and also of children's rights. Children's rights emerged over the years in the former century, but in 1989 the world agreed to have a treaty, special treaty, a convention on the rights of children. And the Convention on the Rights of a Child is a human rights treaty. It's about human rights of children, human rights of a special group of human beings, children. And on the 20th of November, which was already the Year of the Child, the annual Year of the Child, the international community, through the United Nations, adopted in New York the convention. And that adoption was preceded by 10 years of drafting, and so there was reason to celebrate. There was pictures with the Secretary General and children. There was congratulations, and for some of you that are a bit older, Audrey Hepburn in the middle. She was the then Goodwill ambassador for Unicef, very important to make governments ready and willing. And it all happened in and around New York General Assembly. It was also a month in which much more happened. The Berlin Wall fell, and I show that picture because it is representing basically the end of the world, of the then Cold War. And I'm showing that because we have to understand all the time that the standards we are dealing with are product of its time, of their time. So the convention was drafted in a time frame that was different. The world then was different. Because if we go to the time frame we are in now, 30 years later, 2019, I think we see a different world for children. Children live much more than before in the digital environment. They didn't live in the digital environment in 1989. Now they do. Children march for climate change. Children organize themselves online, offline, around themes that matter to them. Sometimes themes that are very close to them and are about their individual talents and prospects and opportunities, and sometimes it's more driven around societal themes, including climate change. There is currently a lot of attention for family forms and the way children grow up and what that means also in terms of protection of children. Just an example, modern families. There is now gay marriage across the globe spreading, basically. And there are many issues related to that, including, for example, assisted reproductive technologies for children to be born, coming with all kinds of questions that we didn't really address before. And we see, and that's in the far right corner down, the children's rights and business principles emerging as a response to the responsibility of businesses for children's rights. And that is an issue that has emerged in the past decade and didn't really exist in the 1980s. So we are now here, 30 years later, with a Convention on the Rights of the Child that builds on the notion of human rights that emerged in the former century and was basically finding its way into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And on the other hand, we have an international development agenda. And children's rights are part of both. And children's rights are part of that international climate in which there is an ongoing concern about children and children's well-being. And that's the reality we are in. And I'm telling you this because this shows, I think, the dynamic around children's rights. Hello. The dynamic around children's rights, meaning that we have to connect children's rights all the time to the realities of today and to also the changing realities in which children find themselves. And that's an important starting point for our conversation today. All right, taking you a bit to the theory of children's rights. What was there to celebrate in 1989? Why was it important to have a Convention on the Rights of the Child? Well, there are a number of reasons why the Convention on the Rights of the Child could be seen as a game changer. It fundamentally changed the way we look at children from a legal perspective. It basically builds around children as rights holders, as human beings with entitlement equal to entitlements for any other human being. So adults, and within the group of adults, women, migrant workers. So where human rights started off very generally, in the course of the past 30 years of the former century, there was a growing awareness that specific group of human beings required specific forms of protection and also recognition. And children were one of that. Was such a group. And children were basically seen as a group that required a special treaty with, as a starting point, equal rights. That was not an idea that was invented in New York. And that's really an important point to stress. That development built on national developments. There was also at the national level a growing awareness that children have rights and that children have entitlements that bring them much more closely to this rather strong position of adults. So it is, and that's important because sometimes people think that children's rights is some kind of international concept, but it really was building on national developments. And it couldn't have been otherwise because there has to be national support for these kind of developments. Otherwise, it would never have been accepted also by states. However, I have to immediately admit that didn't mean that the whole world was really involved. For example, Africa largely felt left out during the drafting. The drafting of the convention was very much dominated by the West and the Soviet Union. And also the tensions in between these two were very apparent during the drafting. It's one of the reasons why this treaty has become a very comprehensive treaty. On the one hand, protecting individuals against the state, a very Western notion. And on the other hand, looking at the state to take good care of citizens, including children, which was a very Eastern notion. High reliance on state services. And there was really that tension. But Africa, for example, felt largely left out. And it's one of the reasons why they quite quickly after the Convention on the Rights of the Child adopted their own treaty, the African Charter on the Rights and the Welfare of the Child. And in this treaty, you see similar notions, but also different notions around, for example, the children's membership of communities. You see that the African Convention actually explicitly refers to the state, to the child, as a member of its community. So not only family, but also community. And also that convention is also about, for example, responsibilities towards the community, which is a very typical African feature, I would say. You don't find that in the convention that explicitly. Okay, that's a bit of a context, but that was so the first element of this game-changing effect was this fundamental change in the way we approach children as rights holders. And that changed also the narrative. So it was not only about us adults being concerned about children, it was also starting differently. It was actually, what are the entitlements of children actually, because of the fact that they are human beings? That's the first important pillar, you could say, underlying children's rights. The second important one is that it was recognized, rightfully I would say, that children are different. The children are human beings, but they are special human beings. They are a group of human beings. The child does not exist, and a child evolves, develops, matures. So a child of 1 year is a completely different child compared to an adolescent of 14 or 15, and that has to be accommodated and embraced in law. That was at least the perception at that point in time. I think that was still a fair point, still currently as well. But that was recognized. And you see that in a certain dynamic within the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which relates to a growing maturity. Basically, the older and more mature a child gets, the more there is an assumption that a child is also more autonomous. Autonomous in the context of his family, for example. So that's a second pillar, you could say, that the child is recognized in an international document as a human being that is in development and has also, for example, the right to develop. Very fundamental notion of the convention. And the third important pillar of the convention, which I think under the significance of the convention, is that the convention, it was already mentioned, explicitly refers to the child as a member of his family. And that is sometimes a bit confusing, because isn't this about the rights of the child? Yes, it is. But it is also about recognizing children as members of family. So the preamble of the convention refers to the family as the best place for children to grow up in, as a starting point. Article 18, you referred to it already, explicitly recognizes the position of parents as the ones that have the primary responsibility and also a certain liberty to raise children in the way they think they should raise their children. So this convention acknowledges that children are members of family. And that is an important notion that is sometimes overlooked, but I think it underscores that children should be seen in the context of the systems they are in. So including their family, including their parents, and I would also argue, including their communities. Very powerful message. And that comes with rights revolving around protection. It comes with rights revolving around provisions for children, education, healthcare, adequate standard of living, social security. And the protection, then we are talking about protection against violence, protection of children in armed conflict, a humanitarian notion within the human rights document. I'll get to that. And protection when children against detention, for example, unlawful detention. And there is also a category of rights that relate to children's participation. And that is something that was new. This convention basically acknowledges children as participants. It grants children the right to be heard, and it grants children the right to have a say in decision-making, affecting them. And that is directly connected to this notion of children as rights holders. And it's quite innovative that there is a convention on human rights that explicitly refers to the basically growing, emerging autonomy and agency that has to come in one way or the other at a certain point with participation. So that very practically means that decisions can be made, but you should think about the question, to what extent can children have children the right to be included in that decision-making, affecting them? More generally, when you have policy or legislation affecting children, or individually, when a juvenile judge, for example, takes a decision that affects a family situation. Children's participation has become a fundamental pillar of human rights with regard to children. Over the 30 years, we have seen that this Convention on the Rights of the Child developed into a framework that has different layers, UN, regional, and national. Regional, for example, in Europe, Africa, Southeast Asia, Inter-American system, so the Americas. And it has also developed into much more. There is a lot of specific standard setting that was generated by the Convention on the protection of children against sexual exploitation, on armed conflict, optional protocols, on the right to complain internationally for children. And so we have now an enormous framework which touches upon many aspects of children's lives across the globe, but it revolves around this recognition of children as rights holders. And it's assuming equivalence, and it's assuming inclusion. We are talking about all children. And it's assuming visibility. Recognition, equivalence, inclusion, and visibility. And that is something to take along for the rest of my talk. So what does this all mean? And I give different perspectives, and some of my students will recognize this because I use this a lot, and it's important, I think. This Convention on the Rights of the Child has been universally adopted, basically. There's only one country that has not endorsed the convention, and I'm not going to ask that question. I assume you all know it's not North Korea, as many of my students suggest in the first year of our bachelor program when we do some children's rights. No, it's the US. But apart from that, and we can talk about it later if you are interested why, but I don't want to do that now. Generally, wherever you are, across the globe, you can talk about children's rights. And that is also used by international organizations, including, for example, Unicef. Wherever you are, you can talk children's rights. For some people, this is reason to say this is the most successful treaty we have. And I think there's hardly any need to explain that that is, of course, not true. But it's interesting. There's no other human rights treaty yet that has this almost universal support. It's also interesting in light of the parts of the world that felt left out during the drafting. They nevertheless have a need to join. And that's an interesting notion. So even though we have to be concerned about the fact that this may, to a large degree, be a Western product, to put it very negatively, it's nevertheless very interesting to see that there is commitment in all parts of the world, except then from that one country. But even within that country, I'm too critical now, within that country, apart from the administration and the government, there is commitment. So I think this is part, to a certain degree, this is a success story. But I mean, it's way too limited. We have to go deeper. So impact, what do we see? And our research focuses on it in many different ways. Children's rights are very broad, and there's much to cover, but there's a lot happening. Really, a lot happening. So there is legislation being developed, being transformed, being renewed, being adopted, adjusted, whatever, on child protection, on juvenile justice, on children in the digital environment, on family law issues, on schooling. And you see that everywhere. Not everywhere to the same extent and not everywhere that effective, but it's happening. So the legal infrastructure is spreading. Children's Act in South Africa, for example. There is a growing number of courts, internationally, regionally, and domestically, that actually use the CRC or are forced to use the CRC by lawyers or by children themselves and family claiming their rights. So we have done a study on the use of the convention in domestic and regional jurisprudence. It's really interesting to see that there is leadership within judicial institutions to try to make more sense out of children's rights. A very specific example from South Africa, which I like to use, related to a case where a mother who was a primary caregiver for a child was sentenced for credit card fraud to a number of months, and even beyond that, imprisonment. And that case was challenged before the South African Constitutional Court, and the claim was made that because of that imprisonment, the child would be left alone. So the case was not about the child, the case was about the mother and about the state intervening because she has done something that is completely unacceptable, credit card fraud. And she did it not once, she did it more. But ultimately the Constitutional Court said, well, if this woman is a primary caregiver and there's no other caregiver available, then we have to assess to what extent our decision to imprison that mother is in the best interest of the child, referring explicitly to the rights of children. It's an example, but it's showing a willingness within the South African Constitutional Court to think creatively about law and the relationship of parents and children. But it's just an example, there are many others, and it's not always wonderful. Courts are also struggling. A study that will come out over the summer, done by one of our PhD students, also shows, for example, in Australia, a certain lack of willingness within the judiciary to engage with children's rights. So there are other stories as well, but nevertheless, over 30 years, you see an emergence of jurisprudence with tangible outcomes, I would say, for children. Then there is a lot of civil society movement around children's rights, sometimes really driven by children's rights, sometimes building on children's rights, sometimes connecting to children's rights in many different ways. But I think many civil society organizations have found a certain justification for their work in children's rights. And we could discuss that because it's an interesting phenomenon, but I think it's telling. Then we see that there is a growing number of ombudspersons at the national level that are basically like in the Netherlands, the Dutch children's ombudsperson, Margriet Kalverboer currently, who is actually working on a day-to-day basis with children's rights to see how are children actually doing. And are children, for example, heard? For example, in Groningen. Today, I think they are talking about that with children. And it's also interesting to see that children's rights have become part of the narrative for the International Sustainable Development Agenda. So many of the SDGs relate in one or the other way to children's rights. So violence, for example, child labor, access to justice, quality education. You referred to quality education already. Article 28 and 29. So there's something happening. The reality, of course, is difficult and confronting. So we have to make sure that we stay with our foot on the ground. This is all upstream legislation, policy, even adjudication, lawyers working on children's rights. It may be very far away from realities. And there are realities, and I'm sure you know these realities, where children's rights are very far away. And then the question is, where do you start? It's a question we use a lot in our work. We receive the question also regularly. Where do we start? Where do we start if there's continuous conflict affecting children? where there is a lost generation, as Unicef reported on children in Syria, where there are 5.6 million children in need of humanitarian assistance, and that is directly connected to the work of War Child. Mark, you referred to the 450 million children affected by armed conflict. You often see this picture, which I don't particularly like, but I use it nevertheless. There is over 150 million children living on streets. So what is the connection to children's rights? For them, it's extremely difficult to get any access to services that are relevant to children. They may be living on the streets, having no access to education, healthcare facilities. They will be picked up by the police. They will be brought into the justice system because they are considered to be a nuisance and a threat to safety. And they, after a while, being detained, they will be back on the streets. Where do you start? There are millions of children deprived of liberty at a certain point. In the course of the year, there will be a UN global study on deprivation of liberty, which for the first time tries to actually map what is actually happening. Children in juvenile justice facilities, in child protection institutions, in mental health institutions, in immigration detention, being detained for the reason of national security. It's all included in the study, and there is numbers coming out that talk about millions on a daily basis. And often these children are confronted with rights violations, denial of rights, no family contact, no education, no healthcare. Where do you start? And much closer, I think, to home, children on the move. Children on the move that are literally stuck in between. That are in between states, that are in between authorities, that are in between systems, that may be undocumented, illegal, unlawful, stateless, because they are really literally stuck in between. What is the added value of rights, of a convention on the rights of the child there? Very difficult. Yet, I think even in these most difficult circumstances, you can find a justification to call for attention for children within this children's rights framework. And it's used. I don't know to what extent War Child actively engages with that, to force a way in, for example, or to get the cooperation of other partners, or to join forces with international organizations such as SAFE. You use also the children's rights lens in a way to claim also the attention for children. One of the biggest challenges in all these misery to claim the attention for children, to build on these notions of recognition, equivalence, inclusion, and very importantly, visibility. Because this picture is an example of a complete lack of visibility of children. And it's one of the major problems with children's rights implementation across the globe, is the lack of visibility. And that's what brings me to what I see on the basis of our work, research, advisory work, teaching, as cross-cutting challenges. And I have decided to bring 3 to you. I've discussed them elsewhere before, but I think they are still very, very important. And you may want to add, or you may want to frame it differently, but let me start by sharing these with you. And the first one is lack of coordination and cooperation. And it starts by the notion, I think, recognizing that children's rights do not stand on their own. And there is this mantra within children's rights that all children's rights are relevant. We should implement children's rights holistically, comprehensively. We should actually see children's rights as indivisible and interrelated. But if you zoom in on practice, you see fragmentation. You see different silos, compartments, governments not communicating with each other, and within government, different departments working on different issues, and there is no direction, no guidance, no interconnection. How can you justify that if you take the notion that children's rights are equally important and indivisible and interrelated? Then we need coordination. If we zoom on an issues, we see that children's rights issues do never isolate them from other issues, societal issues, underlying issues that are causing children's rights problems. So if we talk about solutions for children's rights issues, we have to recognize that many of the issues that children are confronted with, for example, in the context of detention, are directly related to societal issues such as social exclusion, poverty, discrimination. And we have to recognize that. And if we do that, then we can actually jointly work towards children's rights implementation. And otherwise, we lose each other. So in general, I think there is an issue around knowledge and information, but also about knowledge and information sharing. I'm sure for those working in the field, they recognize. So there are policy implications. We need strong coordination. We need plans. We need to join forces through plans. We need a comprehensive budgeting, and it can be done. There are examples on the basis of the African report on the child well-being from the African Child Policy Forum, where you see that even in the most poor countries, you see that there is coordination around budgeting and budgeting for children. So it's about priorities and about focus. We are talking about cooperation here, also within civil society communities, for example. And a key question, particularly also in light of state responsibilities, is who is actually responsible and who are we talking to? Who is in the lead? And how can you actually make sense of, for example, multi-level government and the combination of state and non-state actors? This is a key issue. Some examples, juvenile justice, for example. Juvenile justice is not only about children in conflict with the law. Juvenile justice is generally very much connected to children's services, to children's care, and to child well-being in general. In terms of rights, children's rights in the context of juvenile justice have to be weighed against rights of others. So you have to join forces in doing that. You cannot isolate your focus on children's interests from the interests of others. But also, if you think in terms of interventions and solutions and protection, you have to make sure that you connect your focus on the juvenile justice system to the focus on these other societal and important issues. Another example, violence. I think you already referred to it. How can you support, for example, parents to deal with their trauma, to deal with their stress? That is at first sight, maybe not so much focused on children's rights, but it's more focused on parents, but it's directly related to children's rights. So it's actually a very good example of where you can acknowledge the importance of investing in parents for the sake of children and children's rights. And that is in the context of violence very important. Violence against children is often related to poverty, to working parents, because there's no other way to have a living, to the lack of support for parents, and also to cultural practices, which is a different issue, of course. We have to address this more comprehensively, otherwise we will never make any progress. That's the first problem. The second problem is quite fundamental, and it's related to this point of recognition. Because we have these standards, and if you ask people working in the field, then I think no one will really object against children's rights. But if you go one step further and you really start to talk to government officials, judges, lawyers, people working for the financial department, the question is really, are you really concerned about children's rights? And very fundamentally, this relates to recognition and equivalence. We see many marginalized groups that do not get the attention in the same way that other groups of children get attention. We are talking about children on the move, we are talking about girls, we are talking about delinquent children, we are talking about children on the streets. Children on the streets are often perceived as problems, not as children. Children with mental disabilities are often seen as problems. Are they also seen as children? Not always. That's the first example of where you see that I'm not so sure whether we are really willing to accept children as rights holders and all children as rights holders. Then the second example is violence. violence is a problem for children's well-being and future perspectives and development, but it's also a very fundamental problem. It's a problem because it's so much connected to the dignity that is underlying children's rights. It's very interesting to see that when we talk about children, there are perceptions, assumptions, accepted practices building on the notion that, well, some violence is not that bad. Violence can be very functional. So should we really abolish that? Even though the standard is quite clear, it is definitely not supported throughout the world. You can see that. If you take a look at the map, the green countries have basically adopted that notion and made it formal. No violence whatsoever. Wherever we are, wherever children are, no violence. And there is blue countries that are actually committed to have something like that, but they are not there yet. And there is a growing number of states, I think 54 or something, that have actually this complete ban on violence. And all the other countries have not. Canada, for example, they differentiate between groups of children in terms of the acceptable level of violence. And directly related to that, of course, and now I'm talking about violence in the home, the most controversial part of it is related to parental authority. It's related to reasonable chastisement. It's related to the assumption that this freedom of parents and recognizing parental responsibilities for children and also supporting parents also may mean that children want to have the room to use some reasonable form of chastisement. And I think we have to think about it, because what does that tell us in terms of our willingness to accept that children are equal? But it's also a very good example because it shows that these international standards are not automatically accepted substantively across the globe. But okay, I think it's a fundamental issue. And I think a final point I want to make here on this point is that we see that children are not sufficiently recognized, and particularly also in the context of emerging issues. So it often takes a while before we understand or recognize that children matter. So for example, everything that relates to digital technology, for example, has for a long time been disconnected from children's rights. Now it is changing. The Council of Europe, for example, is very much investing on this. And also the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child is actually drafting a document that helps states to deal with this. But for a long time, we were not really sure what to do with this. And we didn't really recognize children as actors and relevant actors in the context of digital technologies. There are also examples of groups of issues that are not so much addressed in relation to children because they are, for example, too controversial. Transgender children, intersex children, for example. So what does that tell us about our focus? So we have to do better there, and we have to, I think, make sure that our laws and related policies actually invest much more in this recognition by, for example, providing clear norms. It took until 2007 before this country actually did that in relation to violence. So even in the beginning of this millennium, there was room for reasonable chastisement. And that has changed now. So there you can really see that there is a growing awareness around this, also pushed and supported by a norm in law. But we have to do that in a way that is comprehensive and affecting all children. All right. For some that want to know the data, these data here are from, if I'm not sure, and Corporal Punishment. And the first two columns are about violence in the home. So there's indeed 54 countries that have fully prohibited it. So the vast majority of countries have not done so, which of course makes us wonder what the value of that norm is. Come back to that later, maybe. And the final point I would like to highlight is participation. I discussed with you briefly that participation is one of these very important notions in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And it's actually very fundamental because it's about visibility of children in decision-making affecting them as a group or individually. And what you see is that also in direct relation to this lack of comprehensive recognition of all groups of children being recognized as relevant and as children in the first place, you see that when it comes to participation, we start to struggle. So we may be very willing and committed to protect children. We may be very willing and interested in supporting children and investing in provisions for children. But what should we do with children that when they want to become involved in what is actually done to support them? And I'm concerned there. Even though you see a lot of potential and you see a lot happening, I think we are still in the process of accepting that this is important. And I think we have to do much more also to understand how we can do this properly. But what you often see is that we are, in a way, in a certain agreement that children have the right to be heard, but we cannot do otherwise because there is this norm, which is quite clear and quite strongly formulated, and it's spreading everywhere, the right to be heard. Children have the right to be heard, Article 12. Everyone can basically acknowledge, I think, that they know that. They have heard of it, at least. But what does it actually mean? How do we turn that into meaningful participation? And I think we have to do better there. So for me, a very important fundamental question there is, are we taking children's rights, and children in particular as actors of these rights, really seriously? What do we see? We see inconsistency with regard to when and at what age we grant children capacities. So in one country, you can participate in a court hearing as of 12. In the other country, you can do that much earlier. There are countries that grant children the right to go to a judge if they want to. In this country, that is not possible. There are some informal ways, but not formally. It's going to be looked at the moment, but what does that say about our approach to children? Is that consistent? There are also within systems inconsistency with and between countries. We are struggling to see how we do this. We are not really investing in empowering children to participate. And as a consequence, we say that children cannot participate and do not have the capacity to participate and therefore should not have this opportunity. But what about investing in children first and then assessing whether they are really fit to participate? The approach of the Committee on the Rights of the Child is very open. They say basically we should really invest in all children. We should actually accommodate children as much as we can. The 30 years anniversary this year in the Netherlands, among others, and I'm sure there are many, many events happening around that date, but there's one in Leiden, and it's about young people themselves, how they can actually engage with their rights in a way that also connect to the way they live. So you're all invited. And I think a final point, and that is a very fundamental point, is that I still think that to a certain degree, adults stand in the way. This is very fundamental. This is about also sharing authority. This is about your willingness to open up to what children think that should be done, in general or individually. And there we start to have difficulties. And sometimes, because of the inclusion of children, life becomes extremely difficult and decision-making very hard. An example relates to the case we had in the Netherlands of a 12-year-old. If I'm not mistaken, his name was David. And he actually told the doctors that he didn't want to be treated anymore for his cancer. And Dutch law provides that if you're 12, decision-making affecting you should be done with you and with your parents. If you're 16, then you're fully grown and matured under this law. But if you're 12, you have to do it. But against the will of children, 12, 13, 14, 15, is seriously problematic. You basically cannot do that. And in that particular case, a father brought the case to the court and he said, listen, I'm not willing to accept this. And then the court ruled, and it was held up in appeal that we should actually not assess the capacities of children in light of the outcomes of the decision. And there was a very interesting reasoning. The court basically said we should not assess the capacities of children on the basis of the outcomes of the decision. So in other words, if we don't like the decision, we should not then retroactively say, yeah, it's not something you can decide on. It should make us think, but this is a highly difficult dilemma. What if it were my child? Luckily, they are still under 12. But what if? It's very difficult. But it should make us think. It should make us think, how can we actually invest in children in order to support them in being involved? And that's something that I'm still not sure about, whether we are really willing to accept that. So yeah, there we are. 3 problems. Fragmentation, lack of recognition, equivalence, inclusion, and participation. Why am I using these examples? Because I think ultimately it shows that we should not only focus on a provision or on a right. We should try to see through the rights. We should try to use the rights as a way to reflect on the way we deal with children. And that goes beyond the legal meaning of the document. Because if you take it very legally, well, that's fine, you can do that. And I'm a lawyer myself, so I can perfectly work on that. But I think the framework has evolved into something more. It basically provides us with a narrative that should make us think. And I'm not saying it's a narrative that provides for answers on how to raise children, or to come up with a universal solution to childhood, or whatever that means. It is a way of reflecting on the way we deal with children as human beings. And that's why I, on the one hand, feel very comfortable about the next 30 years, but on the other hand, I'm worried, because the further we get, the more challenging it will become. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Very inspiring at many different levels, Professor Liefaard. We've now come to about approximately 15 minutes time for questions. So we're now opening the floor to anybody who would like to ask a question.
Is there a short answer to why the US doesn't acknowledge the treaty?
No, it has become shorter. Because one of the first reasons, it was quite interesting to see that the US was extremely active during the drafting. And that was part of also the competing against the Soviet Union. But they were on top of it. And then ultimately they just signed, Bill Clinton signed. One of the reasons was that the Convention on the Rights of the Child clearly abolishes the death penalty for children. And up until 2005, the death penalty could still be applied to children in the US. But then the US Supreme Court ruled that should be seen as unconstitutional, against their own constitution. But interestingly, they referred to the international standards as standards that show that there is a certain evolving decency which they should adhere to. So that's interesting. So that is an example of where there is something happening around children's rights in the US. But the fundamental thing, apart from the US not feeling very inclined to commit to an international system, and the struggles that they have there, is that there is this idea that children's rights are a threat to the rights of parents and family. So the protection of the family is a very big thing. It is also driven by religious drivers, but very fundamentally, that is the problem. There is that in the US, there is a very significant hesitance against the state as being the protector of children against family. And to a certain degree, they have a point there. Because what the child welfare system shows in the US is that the best interest of the child as a principle to protect children has been very much used in a way that is disproportionately affecting families from lower class communities, and also, for example, Afro-American communities and Latin American communities. And that is a big issue. So that's the impact of the approach towards protecting the best interest. So they have a point there. They are skeptical towards the state as the protector. And right, I mean, if you take a look at the Netherlands, we have a whole youth care system, and the state is basically the service provider, but it has been decentralized to communities, and it is quite messy at the moment, to put it mildly. So one of my questions is, I think for the years to come, this high reliance on the state as the protector of children's rights, to what extent is that credible? And what should we actually take from non-state actors? And ultimately the combination, I think. And what is then also the responsibility of a non-state actor? Because this framework is primarily targeted at the state, not at these non-state actors. But I think there is movement around this. So maybe in 30 years, we will also be talking more about civil society's responsibilities to protecting children, more also justified on the basis of children's rights as something to be protected. Yeah. Well, it's quite a long answer, actually. Yeah.
Thank you. Maybe you can state your name and who you work for.
I'm Christy Stanlowski. I work actually for the Child Law Department of Leiden University. Thank you for your speech, Ton. I was wondering that the three problems you just mentioned are still much phrased from an adult perspective. And I think if you're talking about how do we get the rights there where they should be, I think it's also interesting to think about the victims, the children. Yesterday, we were talking about how child participation is lacking in research, and we were thinking that maybe it's also that if children are really traumatized by war or by abuse at home, they don't really feel trust in the world around them again. Yeah. So they think, what good is a complaint procedure, or what good is maybe this great NGO with all those adults working there? What good is in it for me? So how could we, next to these things you pointed out, also target the most vulnerable children, the ones that are maybe lost trust in the world and in their rights? Maybe they're not even aware of their rights. How do we get them to be aware of their rights and know that there's this framework protecting them in the future?
Yeah, and maybe add to that, I mean, how can you actually recognize that the position children are in is relevant also for the assessment what is to be expected from children participation? So, for example, if children have been, for example, in a child protection system for years, they may have completely lost their trust in adults and in the system and in anything that is related to the decision making also. So then the investment maybe is, okay, how can we make sure that we recognize that and that we can actually connect to that experience of children? Because otherwise we may indeed, from an adult perspective, do all kinds of investments without having actually a good understanding of how children want to be included. And that's a very fundamental notion, that a right is a right to be used by the owner. So a child owns the right. That is the change in the narrative. That's the game-changing thing. It's not the parent that owns that right. Yes, parents have rights as well. Don't take me wrong. But children have rights. But it's not compulsory to use rights. So you should always recognize that, I think. When the District Court of Amsterdam, an example, started to include more children in their proceedings by lowering the age for hearing. So they said, as of 8, we are going to invite children. Even though the law doesn't force us to, we are going to do it. And a significant number of children suggested that they don't want to be heard. So they rather go to school. And for example, so that should make us think that we should always connect, I think, to how children want to be included. And that means that we have to reach out to them and to see how we could include them in our research to get a better understanding. Framing them is also very tricky. So one of the outcomes, I think, of children's rights in the first years was that in certain areas, and this is connected to the work of War Child, in certain areas, we are approaching children as victims, primarily as victims, and sometimes even dominantly as victims. And I mean, there's many good reasons. For example, children in armed conflict, they are victims. However, when it comes to responses and interventions, we should broaden the scope again. The victim status may be a starting point, but ultimately we should not forget that that doesn't mean that you should not try to include children, for example, in your interventions. And that's something I would like to talk to you about, and also with you, if you already have suggestions, is how can you make your interventions inclusive? And maybe you're already doing that, in order to prevent that you are, as a group of well-intended adults, are taking all kinds of decisions that may even be counterproductive. Because there is, you know that much better than I do, but there is research which I used for a chapter on child soldiers and the imagery around children in armed conflict that basically suggests that you have to acknowledge children's agency also in armed conflict and also in the interventions. And if you do not do that, you may even victimize them again. But also the acceptability of them reintegrating in the communities is important in that regard. So you cannot move away from recognizing that children are and have also been actively involved in one or the other way. So that is important also. Is that answering the question? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, hello. I stay seated because I have a sore foot. I'm sorry. My name is Jacobijn. I'm a volunteer for War Child. And I had a question. I have to think of it. Thinking of the credit card fraud example. The problem I have, also being a devil's advocate, is that the right of the child in this case is very general. So does it always override local laws? That's one part of my question, because sometimes Western countries have good laws in place for children's rights, I assume. And in this case, the credit card, you could say that a mother who does this might also not treat her child right, and you should look more in depth to what the child is, in best interest of the child.
Sure.
So then I really feel that the right of the child is being used as a general principle, which is so big for the case at hand. So how do you solve that? Does it get boiled down to smaller? You understand? I'm sorry. I don't know if I'm clear, but
no,
it's
very clear.
Okay. Because that's my problem a little bit, that it's such a container thing then.
At first sight this, and it is used also as such. Oh, sorry. So
it's not about this child, it's about the child then. And in this case, it's used almost against it. You could use it against the child as well. So how do you avoid that?
Sure.
Does it always override local law, or can you also use local law against? You know what I mean? Or is
sure, absolutely. Yeah. There are different elements in your question, but sticking to the don't worry. Sticking to the use of best interest. That is seriously problematic. There are some people saying we don't want to have best interest in the Children's Rights Convention because it's used by everyone in different ways. In family law situations, it's used by parents, for example, in completely different directions. It's seriously problematic. At the same time, it gives an opportunity. It gives an opportunity to assess what is actually needed and good for children. And it basically states that if you have different assessments to make, because there's never a case that is only about children, it's always about others as well. The best interest of the child basically provides for a procedural safeguard that you should not forget to include best interest, and even more, you have to include it in a way that is providing a perspective that is potentially also more important. And there it becomes a bit tricky, because is it really good for a child to make this decision? Well, in this particular case, I know that there has been a real assessment made to assess that. So is it really good for the child? Because maybe the credit card fraud was not so much related to pervert behavior, but more to social conditions that made the mother do that. So is it really good for the child to stay in the shack? Made on the basis of the best interest of the child principle to say we should have taken a different decision. But that is not done without any proper assessment. But your point is more fundamentally, I think, also that as such, being an open norm, it can never override national law without anything else. So you have to tailor it to the individual situation, and there it results in an assessment. However, that's one of the big problems with it, because then what kind of protection is that? What kind of so it is the way I approach it is to connect it to rights in a broader sense. Just so to connect to, for example, these more fundamental notions included there. So rights is ultimately about securing development. It's also ultimately about promoting the child's independence, not immediately, but ultimately, as an independent citizen in a way. It's about addressing issues that stand in the way of development and future perspectives. And so a baseline could be, it's never in the best interest of the child to disregard that. But that doesn't give the answer to all the questions. Yeah. But there's a very experienced children's rights expert, Nigel Cantwell, you may know him. He has written and talked about the best interest of the child, and he at a certain point said, well, maybe we should take it out. It's something from the past. It's something that is not about rights. It's something that is basically about us assessing what is good for children. But I think there's a point in having it. Yeah.
It's done the rights, or can you still change them? Are they constantly changed?
Yeah. It's very dynamic. But I mean, some rights are less dynamic than others. But ultimately, that's why I started with the realities in which children live. You have to continuously assess the meaning of rights in the realities of today. So there is an evolution going on. Yeah. And what the courts basically do here, they contribute to that. So they basically say to a criminal court judge in South Africa, not in another country, but in South Africa, listen, if you are sentencing a primary caretaker, you have to think about the impact of your decision on the family. And that is, I would say, progress. Yeah. That's very interesting. Yeah. And L.B. Sachs was one of the judges there. And I had the pleasure of meeting him in December. And he was so inspiring. He was talking about this. And he said, listen, children's rights do not stand on their own. They have to be balanced against the rights of others. And it's a very delicate thing. And sometimes you don't know where to start. But he ultimately said, yeah, but children's rights do give us a narrative that help us to make any sense of this, you know? So, okay, let's hold on to that.
My name is Isaac. I work at War Child. Thank you for the talk. I kind of had the same question, and I don't know if it was answered already, but what was the outcome of the case with obviously the committing fraud? Was the woman convicted, or was the child helped, or?
Yeah, the woman was convicted, but not to imprisonment. So the court reversed the sentence to a community sentence. I mean, she did something that was not acceptable, so you cannot move away from that. And she did it not only once, but she was a repeated offender. So ultimately, the court, the case was sent back to the court of the criminal court, and the criminal court had to take a new decision, and they decided to not to imprison, but to impose. I'm not entirely sure what it was, but I think it was a community sentence, and may also have been a suspended imprisonment. So don't do it again, but you can still take care. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Adirun Kadebit. I'm a fellow at the African Studies Center.
Nice.
Yeah.
Very good.
I at the beginning of, oh, sorry, I met you along the line. It's about national participation in the Child's Rights Convention.
Yeah.
Yeah, apart from the US that has daringly come out to say, I think we have enough and we are not going to do this. What's your perspective or opinion on African countries' participation? Because, like you said, many of the African nations are parties to the CRC, the Child's Rights Convention. They also have that allegiance to their regional, they have that regional preference for the African Charter on the Rights of the Child, and they've endorsed both. Now, apart from having to service this to the convention and the charter, we are familiar with the fact that the African society especially is decked with series of indigenous laws that conflict with the state laws and national laws. So they have to service all those laws. So I would want to know your opinion, just your opinion on how these laws have worked in Africa, considering the fact that they don't seem to have a straight forward. They are not so connected, if I put it that way. You know, instead of looking, we've seen the US, isn't it? But I want us to also look at the African situation, that although we have painted them as part of those paying allegiance to these treaties, but are they really paying allegiance to anything?
Yeah.
Your opinion? Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Well, you know, that shows the pluriform nature of legal systems. And I think there are different if you zoom in on the domestic level, you see a wide variety of legal systems existing. And sometimes it's not necessarily a legal system, it's maybe more a social system. And that affects the way children are approached. And the question is, what is the relationship between these international norms, African regional norms, and then this multiple set of systems? And that is. I mean, there's no one answer to it. I think the reality is that these domestic traditional systems, or whatever you call them, they are there for a reason. You know, they have emerged over the years, over the centuries, that has a strong historic basis. And I think children's rights, this international movement around children's rights, has become part of that. So there is now an interaction going on, and the question is, what does it ultimately mean for the protection of children? And there are some interesting observations to make, because you could say, what is the justification for taking the norm from the international standard? Why not taking it bottom up? And then there is something interesting happening. So there's quite a lot of, Africa is one of the continents where there's a lot of legislative reform. So apparently many African states feel it necessary to adopt new laws protecting children. And that's really interesting. So there's South Africa, there's Namibia, there's Tanzania, I mean, I can give many examples, and maybe you know them yourself. So apparently there is an attempt to align legislation at the national level to this regional international framework. And then there's something else happening, and that is that the norms being present at the national level, even within local communities, they seem to shift. So for example, the protection of all children is an issue there. So there are many local systems in which children mature or be seen as adults much earlier than elsewhere. So for example, because they are circumcised, or because they are married, or for other reasons. And there we end up in a different frame. there is something around cultural practices that may be harmful. And there you see, and there is an interesting piece of work on that from one of my colleagues, Professor Julia Slot-Nielsen, who is also working with us, but also in South Africa as a professor. And she has this growing development towards recognizing that all children should be protected. And there is she really comes up with all kinds of examples of local and national changes in norms and around controversial issues. So that shows that there is a dynamic. It's an evolution, yeah. But yeah, it's a bit difficult to say the evolution should be like this. I'm always a bit hesitant, so I prefer to take the observer position and see what is actually happening. But I was checking it before I came to this meeting. I mean, there is quite a from the women's rights movement and from the children's rights, yeah, to really address harmful cultural practices for the sake of protecting young girls. And this very morning, there was a report from Unicef on boys being married. And it's always about girls, so that was quite interesting. We are talking about hundreds of millions of children that are forced into marriage. And as a consequence, they are basically not regarded as children anymore. So that means that has significant implications for their potential and for their access to education and etc. And also to their health and protection against violence. So yeah, that is an issue, I would say. Yeah. It's a difficult question and a long answer. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Florence Kiff from War Child with the communications team. Thank you for a really inspiring discussion and talk, and to everybody else as well, and for the audience for asking good questions. Number of organizations are now starting to think that the CRC in itself isn't sufficient. Yeah. In the sense that it covers all children under one umbrella, boys and girls, and we've conveniently, you've just highlighted the issue of girls, and organizations are saying it's time to develop rights of the girl, who really live very different lives and different realities to boys, and it's obviously it's a relatively new topic. People are talking about it. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts as a professional in the field as well. And obviously, we know girls are often forgotten in the conversation. Yeah. But if I could just be a little bit cheeky and just say one of your slides refers to children as him rather than
you're right.
him and her.
Yeah.
So,
I should change that. Yeah, I should mix maybe, or no.
No, but it's just it's an example that, and we see this a lot, and we need to be very aware of it. And I couldn't go away by not raising it.
Sure, of course. Well, thanks for doing that. Thanks for doing that. The question is, would that deliver new norms? Or is it more about recognition of girls? And that's something that I'm struggling with. What particular norms should we include in an instrument like this that is specifically favorable to girls? I tend to think the implications of norms for specific groups. So, for example, my first piece of proper research was around the position of detention, children in detention. My PhD was on that, and there I identified different norms applicable there and how that could play out in reality. And we have to recognize that girls are in such a situation as well, and there are really different implications. So, for example, the level of protection, for example, needed for certain situations are different. So, in very specifically in the context of institutions, hygiene is extremely important. And if hygiene is not there, then you may be earlier in a situation where you actually violate the protection of children against violence, or even beyond that, because you're systematically denying, for example, the need of hygiene for girls, more important than for boys, maybe, arguably. So I'm not sure whether we need something specific on girls in terms of a convention. We also have CEDAW, which is a specific convention on women's rights, but it's generally, even though it expanded, and for many good reasons, I think it started off by a fight against discrimination. and then it took much more. So I'm not sure. And I had this discussion with Plan International also, because they have also started to focus on girls. And they developed in Geneva, for example, Plan Geneva, they took the lead in developing a big database with everything that relates to law and standards and rules and girls. And they also came up with suggestions in the same direction. Should we develop something specific for girls, right of girls? I am not sure what that would look like. But I fully agree that the dynamic around children's rights is largely focused, no, not large, no, I'm not saying that well. I think there is a real need to focus on girls. That is absolutely true. Yeah, yeah.
Great. With that, thank you very much. A big applause for Professor Liefaard. I think you've given us a lot of food for thought, certainly for me, for us as an organization. The use of the CRC as a narrative framework, maybe as much as a legal framework, the indivisibility of the right, and maybe some of the tensions around participation versus best practice. The best interest of the child, and for me, very thought-provoking. So thank you very, very much. I would like to thank you with a beautiful bouquet of flowers again.
Leuk, dankjewel.
Thank you.
Dank je. Leuk, hè? Ja.
With that, thank you all very, very much for coming. Thank you for War Child colleagues for really making this possible. And have a drink with us, stay a little bit longer, a little bit more interaction, and stay tuned. There will be another masterclass in a couple of months. Thank you very much.